2, 1, smile, expressions. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another live episode of Unlock Your Potential. This is our 4th episode as we bring the guest speakers from all across the globe. And today also we have a very, very special guest, in fact, a good friend, Mr. Bill Corner, who has joined us all the way from Washington, D.C. And I really appreciate it's a bit early in the morning in Washington. And along with Bill, we have Neville gone from UK all the way, our regular panelist, and Mr. Kamran Rizvi from Islamabad. So we are all familiar with our regular panelists. So just a quick introduction about Bill. Bill specializes in helping professionals crystallize their key messages and deliver them in a clear and compelling ways in speeches and presentations. As we were discussing with Bill, he feels that amid Corona pandemic, the world actually is moving on internet bandwagon. So to communicate, he believes the challenges of expressing thoughts in a clear manner or managing teams remotely will equally become quite challenging as we move forward and get used to this virtual and digital space as we are doing it right now. So Bill is a media coach, media specialist. He's been traveling all over the world and has been actually coaching the senior executives of the Fortune 500 companies such as the Ritz-Carlton, KFC, Pizza Hut, the World Bank, the US State Department, the Saudi Airline, Saudi General Investment Authority, and MILE, the Medina Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship. And that's where, Bill, we got to know each other about 6 to 7 years ago. Is that correct, I guess?
Fortunately for me, Ali, yes, that's where we first met at MILE in Medina. I believe it was 2012, actually, so 8 years. 8 years.
Yeah, it was a compliment that Bill was giving that normally Bill is a clean shape, but he's growing his mustache, and he said he's trying to emulate me, so that's a positive note to start with.
That's right. Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yeah. And unlocking your potential, as you were saying, so you have got a mustache. Anyhow, Bill, so let me kick start. I mean, as we were discussing earlier, in informal discussion, but let's make it formal. Lockdown situations, everybody's jumping on digital space. I've been receiving invitations for webinars, online meetings, 3-4 times a day. That was unheard of about almost a few months back, when actually I've been trying to promote the webinar culture in Pakistan, and everybody looked at me, what is it? And now we are receiving this invitation 3 to 4 times. So where are we moving, and what challenges do you foresee when it comes particularly to communication and presentation and talking to, the interface of LCD or digital screens?
Well, let me start from where I came from and where I see us moving now. So I'm a former television journalist. I was a White House correspondent for a number of years. My company is called Oratorio. It's based here in Washington. And yes, of course, for most of my 20 years doing this, it's been a face-to-face proposition primarily. We work with people, as you said, government officials, business executives, and so forth, to show them how to perform more effectively when they're doing television interviews with journalists, but also, as you said, presentations and speeches and meetings and conferences, all of those types of things. We work with them to show them how to put together more compelling content and then deliver it in a more polished way from the point of view of body language and speech and eye contact and all of those kinds of things. So just as you said, in the past couple of months, none of that has occurred, while at the same time I'm on webinars and programs like this all the time. And of course, I would predict that this is going to be the new reality for a long time. I think probably my opinion of this changes by the week, it seems. But I think this is very much going to be a new reality. And even for our business at Oratorio, we're completely re-engineering how we work with existing clients, how we find new clients, and so forth. So from the point of view of managing teams, my advice is to follow many of the same guidelines that we espouse as concerns presentations and speeches. So first and foremost, and it's a several part type of thing. It begins with the on-camera environment, if you will. I'm sure you've seen all the time that people sitting in their home offices are not doing it very well. The lighting is bad. The camera is in the wrong place. There are distractions in the background. The lighting is bad so that the person on camera looks like death warmed over, as we say here in the in the United States. So it begins with that. We're not talking about a Hollywood production, but even if you are a manager and you're doing your daily check-in with your team or your weekly, whatever it happens to be, my advice is to make an effort to make the on-camera environment look reasonably presentable. You can go to great lengths. So as I talk to you this morning, I'm sitting in my living room in my house in Washington, D.C., and I'm simply sitting in front of a window. So I have some good natural light coming in from the window. It's kind of a cloudy day. If it were really a particularly bright and sunny day, maybe if we were doing it this at noontime local time, I might want to have some sort of filtered light, have the light come through some diaphanous curtains or something like that. But anyway, rule number one is that you want to position yourself as the speaker or the leader with light coming toward you rather than coming from behind. If you sit in front of a window with the light behind you, it darkens your face and it's just not a very attractive on-camera appearance. As I said, the way I'm doing it right now really is very simple. I'm not even bothering with an external microphone or with lighting and so forth. So there are extremes, right? You can do it very, very simply, like I'm doing. I'm just talking into my the webcam on my laptop, and I have natural light coming in. For people who really want to have a more polished sort of look, I do recommend using a better webcam than the one that probably comes on your laptop. Lighting is, you can buy really quite inexpensive lighting online that you should have pointing toward you. You can even use a common table lamp and have that pointing toward you, but just try to have light coming from the front rather than from above or from behind. And then secondly, in order to ensure that your audience, whether that audience is a presentation audience, strictly speaking, or if it is just a daily or a weekly meeting, because of course you have no way of knowing whether the people that you're talking to are paying attention or not. I mean, you can tell fairly well, right? I can see you, I can see Neville, I can see Kamran. They're very politely nodding their head and they're paying attention. But actually, Neville could very well be playing a video game down here off camera, and I wouldn't know, would I, Neville? Anyway, so
exactly.
So that of course is the challenge. If you're seated at a table with people, you can tell that they're paying attention. There are ways that you can improve the odds, if you will, in this type of a situation, and it begins with, as I said, a more professional, more polished looking visual presentation in terms of what you look like and what your room looks like on camera. But then also, and again, this goes back to advice about better speeches and presentations, make an effort to work and deliver information that is visually professional, right? You want to, just the way you want to avoid what we call death by PowerPoint in a live situation. It's probably even more important in this type of situation. Don't sit there with slides that are incredibly busy and difficult to read. Try to use simple, compelling visuals. I'll tell you a short story here. My partner and I were hired the week before last to help a husband and wife team in India, in Ahmedabad, who are engineers. They're working on a technology which is called bungru, and bungru in the Gujarati language means drinking straw. And essentially, they are trying to solve the problem that many farmers in the developing world have, which is in the monsoon season, there's too much water and the farmland becomes waterlogged. In the dry season, there's not enough water. So they have put together a fairly simple system whereby when the heavy rains come, it's diverted to the natural water table below the farmland. And therefore the surface soil is not oversaturated. And in the dry season, that water can be easily brought up for irrigation, right? So we were coaching these two people who have this program. They've introduced it in many different areas of India, and they're trying to bring it worldwide. What was interesting about their presentation was that it was beautifully visually simple. The story was very, very straightforward. The technology itself was not that difficult to understand for a non-engineering audience. And so we were preparing them to go talk about this technology at international conferences. Before coronavirus, they were going to go to the United Nations and talk about it. They were going to go to Geneva and talk about it. Well, now they're going to be giving presentations the way we're doing it right now. And to make a long story short, the presentation is very effective now because the story is so straightforward and because the visuals are so simple and so beautiful. So certainly in certain types of work settings, if you're trying to bring teams through a process, for example, it can't be just beautiful photographs and nothing else. You do have to have some detail on the slide or whatever sort of visual that you're going to use. But that is, to come back to the original point, when you're working with teams in meeting types of settings, if you can make it interesting for them, if you can make an effort to incorporate some of these elements of better presentation making and delivery into your regular meetings, it doesn't really take that long. It's respectful of your team. Your team will appreciate your leadership for trying to make it interesting. And then the other thing I would mention is try to include some interactivity into the meeting. In other words, don't just talk at the audience for the entire time. Do some occasional check-ins, maybe every 3 minutes or so, ask a question of the group or of an individual, just to make sure that they're paying attention, and therefore they'll know that they have to continue to pay attention if they can anticipate that you're going to call on them. The last thing I'll say before the next question is I have to commend my friend Neville here, because Neville is doing some branding with his organization. Neville has his logo, an image of the MindFit map. Very, very important to remind your audience of who you are, the name of the organization, the brand. Again, in an internal meeting, perhaps it's the people on your team, they know the name of the company that they're working for. But it's something that people forget to do, and it can go a long way because people need to take in information visually, they need to take it in orally, meaning AURALLY. People have different types of learning styles, so having the branding in the background is great.
Really? Or having an attitude in the background.
Right.
You mentioned something that is really important. This is pretty simple stuff at the bottom line here. I mean, excuse my attire, but I've just literally come off from the BBC, and I've only got one study, so it's the backdrop or nothing, frankly. But it is this. Just think of the simple things, and the majority of this is a lot of people forget who the audience is.
Yeah, that's right.
Only when you're on that public speaker route that you've done a lot of, and I know all four of us have done quite a bit of over our years, that do you always have in mind who the audience is. And what I've found people struggle online is that because they can't see the audience, I've seen teachers walk away from the screen when 30 children are looking on Google Classroom and thinking, well, where's the teacher gone? I can still hear the teacher, but where's the teacher gone? So it's almost this, you've almost got to closet yourself around that you are stuck in many respects in front of a screen. But if you do need to walk around, then just push the screen further back. Again, right. Simple stuff, really.
Well, and that's a very interesting point. There is a device that some educators use, which is called a swivel, which is voice activated. So for example, you can use it with an iPhone or with an iPad or with any manufacturer's tablet device. You put it in the swivel, you wear a wireless microphone, and the swivel follows the sound of your voice. So if you walk a few steps over this way, the entire iPad or the entire tablet will turn and follow you. But you're right. If you don't have one of those, just pull the camera back a little
Push
bit.
The screen away. Use right. Maths or something. Yeah?
Right.
Physics.
Well, and one other thing from a consumer technology point of view, if you will, is that you can get an external webcam that has a wider angle than your built-in webcam on your laptop may have. So another thing to consider.
Good stuff.
Yeah, and just as Bill, you were mentioning, keep it a bit interactive. So I'm seeing there are audience who have already joined in. So folks, if you have any questions, you can always raise your hand in between to ask a question as well, or you can put it in the question box. We'd be happy to read them on your behalf. But Kamran, bye, over to you. Any questions? Kamran, bye, you have muted. Your mic is muted.
Yes. Thank
okay,
you.
now we can hear you.
Bill, my question to you, because this is a subject of interest to not only ourselves, but also those listening. And I find that how we communicate is 90% of the battle. We can have good content and substance, and we can make a mess of it. Or we can have nothing really to write home about, and yet the speaker can mesmerize and win the day. Now, my question here is more from an ethical lens. And I just want to understand what is the difference between spin doctoring and being effective. Because what I've learned is that effectiveness is getting the message across as intended and to evoke the feelings and responses as desired. So here comes the question, where does ethics sit in this capacity to engage and inspire and motivate and influence audiences?
My personal opinion is that ethics are paramount. And as we said before we got on the call, for the benefit of all of the other viewers and listeners on the call, I would prefer to not dive too deeply into specifics of politics and one leader versus another here. But what I will say is that, in my view, good communications are synonymous with good ethics. We always say, when, for example, if my company Oratorio is training a politician here in Washington, or a business executive in Saudi Arabia, or a leader of another type in, I think I've done this training in 26 countries around the world now. Obviously, there are cultural differences that have to be acknowledged and respected. But I believe that in good times and in bad times, being truthful and being forthright is of the utmost importance. Now, that doesn't mean, at the same time, talking about media interviews here specifically, that you necessarily have to go exactly where the journalist chooses to go. The two things are not mutually exclusive. You can have your agenda and your opinions and your messages and your priorities, but just because, as an example, a reporter may want to ask you about something else that you don't particularly want to spend time talking about, you can, in a credible way, talk about what you choose to talk about. There are exceptions, of course, for leaders in government, leaders in business. In certain situations, of course, the buck stops with you. And forgive me if that's a very American expression. I believe that was coined by President Truman back in the late 1940s. But in other words, in certain situations, if a direct question is asked of you as a leader, sometimes you can't pivot and talk about what you want to talk about. But it's very much a case-by-case situation. And
Bill, if I may interrupt, you used to give us this case study of Bill Clinton's interview on 60 Minutes. I think that's quite a mixture of the balance of ethics and what needs to be avoided and what needs to be said, and remain a bit ethical also. I mean, if you may want to highlight that again, I don't know if that's relevant.
Sure. No, that's an excellent example, and that was 20 years ago, so it's a little less contemporary.
But that's very interesting.
Yeah, but what Ali is referring to is, in February of 1998, the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke in the American news media. It was broken by a blogger named Matt Drudge on something called the Drudge Report. And this was an evening in February of 1998. The following day, President Clinton had an interview scheduled with the main anchorman from the PBS NewsHour, which is the big public television evening newscast here in the United States. And going that evening, anticipating the interview that he was going to do with this journalist, Jim Lehrer, the following day, President Clinton prepared for that interview, assuming that he was going to, or he would have prepared for that interview, assuming he would be asked questions about the war in Bosnia, about the economic, the US, the global economy at the time, whatever other sort of issues were in the news at the moment. Well, the night before, Matt Drudge breaks the story about this young woman having an affair with the president in the White House. And so, of course, all of a sudden, President Clinton knew that interview the following day was going to be only about this allegation, which is what it was at that point. So sometimes when Oratorio does media training sessions, we use a 3.5-minute clip of that interview to show how President Clinton stayed on message. But it's a great example because what he did was not particularly ethical, because he was not really telling the truth. He was extremely disciplined in staying on message. We have, if you remember, Ali, there were four messages that he got out in that interview.
Yes.
He said, I didn't instruct anyone to lie. There is no inappropriate relationship with this young woman, emphasis on the present tense. There is no inappropriate relationship. He said, I have to get back to the work of the country, and I'm going to cooperate with the investigation. So over the course of 3.5 minutes, he said those things one way or another more than 20 times. So our point in showing that is that he was very disciplined, and he talked about what he wanted to talk to the extent that his messages were unmistakable. You could have been a Clinton cheerleader, or you could have been a Clinton hater, but you still, no matter who you were, you heard his messages and you remember his messages. You may not have believed them, you may not have liked them, or you might have believed them or liked them. But the point was, they were so clear, they were so repetitive that you heard them and you remembered them. But from an ethical point of view, what President Clinton did was not appropriate, because for all intents and purposes, he was lying in that interview. And this is particularly important in a crisis situation, gentlemen. The people need their leaders to be straightforward with them. And again, I don't want to get into any political opinions here, but it's important that the truth be told. It can be told on one's own terms, as long as it remains the truth.
And that goes not just in the political context, but in a business context too.
Absolutely.
And you keep your team engaged and with you by telling them a version of the truth which is acceptable, if you like, because they can't necessarily know everything that's happening. I mean, that's part of leadership, I suppose. But they can, if they ask the difficult questions, you shouldn't duck them. You should answer them honestly, ethically, in particular. I mean, we have a phrase in the UK: ethics isn't south of Suffolk. And anyone that knows, thanks for laughing, Bill. Anyone that knows the geography of the UK, Suffolk is north of Essex, not ethics. Londoners say ethics. So absolutely, business ethics, political ethics, personal ethics, always up the front. And you shouldn't lose your integrity, even when you have to say you're wrong. So admit it, move on, and people will respect you for it.
Yes,
Cameron.
sir.
Just a question linked to this, which is that charisma is a word that keeps coming up when it comes to speakers. Could you shed some light on that? Because for me, I have a view which is very different, but coming from your own specialism and expertise, I think it will be very useful, particularly from our audience's perspective as well. I mean, what is this thing called charisma? Is it really critical to have, or it's not really that important? It is something else which you could shed light on.
As you know, Kamran, some people have it naturally, other people somewhat less so. But the good news is that I won't say that charisma is a learnable skill, but being a compelling communicator is a learnable skill if one makes the effort. So, for example, let's just talk about on-camera presentation. If you're looking at me sitting here and I'm sort of slouched in a chair, or I'm sort of leaned over like this, and my body language looks a little bit indifferent, and I'm yawning perhaps, or if I'm looking over here and looking over there while I'm leading the meeting or delivering the presentation, it doesn't send a positive signal to you, the team member, to you, the viewer. Whereas if I make an effort to sit up straight in my chair and to perform, frankly, we tell people that they need to be a somewhat bigger, a somewhat more emphatic, even passionate version of their regular selves. Now, there's a difference between a Monday morning staff meeting and a persuasive presentation in front of 500 people watching on Zoom or what have you. But just fundamentally, from a performance and delivery point of view, I would really encourage people to be themselves, very much be themselves, but to try to be a somewhat more performing version of their regular selves. Because I was a television reporter for a long time and I used to stand out in the cold and, yell into the camera, I'm used to projecting my voice and to use gestures and so forth. So that's the number one thing that I would encourage people to do, rather than saying, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly meeting. What are we going to talk about? Oh, yeah. To really kind of be forceful, to speak with a certain amount of urgency, to have that inhabit your voice and your whole persona, use your gestures. People will often say, well, if I have kind of a tight camera angle, why do I need to use my gestures if nobody can see them? Well, I'm sort of using my hands down here, but you can see how it kind of animates the upper part of my body. And if I lean back here, you actually can see my gestures. The other thing is try to use gestures that are descriptive. At the very minimum, try to use gestures. Don't just sit there like this. But if you can choreograph this beforehand, or if you're smart enough to do it on the fly, try to use descriptive gestures. So in other words, if you say something like, team, I'm very pleased that our results are up 4% this week, or I want to commend our team in Karachi for doing this, as well as our team in Islamabad for doing this. Right? Try to let your gestures evoke the meaning of your words somehow.
I get it. Thank you.
Of course.
Sorry for butting in there, but I think the interesting thing from what you're saying, and excuse my hands because they'll go all over the place. They usually do. The interesting thing from what you're saying, Bill, is that if anyone's just listening in now, they're not listening to, this is how you behave digitally. This is how you behave. So when you are talking to your team, the fact that we are, I don't like this term physical distancing. I prefer, social distance. I prefer physical distance because that's what we are here.
Yeah.
Behave like normal. So if you're not animated with your team, well, now's the time to be it, frankly, because you're going to get far more of a response from them. And let's face it, they really know you already. So you're not reintroducing yourself to your team. You're all on TV. The other thing is practice. Zoom has given everyone 40 minutes. So you can just have a conversation with yourself, if you like, and then see what it looks like, or get your partner to look in, or worse still, get your kids. So definitely give me feedback. So, but I think the key thing is what you're saying, Bill, is just be natural, Be
natural plus a little something.
Yeah.
A famous person once said, after you give a presentation, you should be a little bit tired, right? There should be, there is an element of physicality in delivering a good presentation. I don't want you to jump up and down and shout, but it's almost invariably when we conduct a training session, a participant will say, gosh, I already feel as though I'm being very loud and I'm projecting my voice. And then we show them what they look like on camera, having recorded it, and they look like a little mouse, so you really, I can't remember more than a handful of times seeing somebody truly overdo it. Somebody really, shouting, and more often than not, people really need to to be themselves plus 20%. Yes.
Yes, Kamran bhai.
Yes,
You've been raising your hand.
and this be yourself. I recall once asking this question. First, I made the suggestion: be yourself and don't try to be someone else. Be comfortable under your skin. So that was the opening remark. And I got a question, but I don't know myself. How can I be myself? And I would like your perspective on this, because I find a lot of people are very unsure of their own identity, what to speak of, the message that they need to deliver, and they're the medium that needs to be very self-assured. And here comes a question: what could be the barrier that prevents people from being themselves?
Well, I charge ordinarily a lot more for a psychiatric examination, Kamran, but no, I'm just kidding. I think the thing to do is what Neville suggested. The camera is the ultimate truth teller. So if you can, and the other caveat here is that all of us are very busy people. We have our jobs, we have our families, etc. And yes, as I think you said, Kamran, or maybe you and Neville both said, practice is absolutely essential. Sometimes when I'll say that to a client, they'll say, Jay, thank you, Bill. You mean on top of the other 1,000 things that I have to worry about this week, you're saying go into a room for a half an hour and turn on the camera and practice. And I am saying that. Because you have, if you watch yourself on camera and you play it back, you will have, that's probably the best means of assessing who you are, at least fundamentally in terms of the way you are perceived by others. You can do if you do a 360 review in your organization, people can tell you about aspects of your personality or your leadership style that maybe you weren't aware of. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, for the on-camera presentation, whether that means, strictly speaking, a presentation, a media interview, or something like leading a meeting, there's no better way to assess who you are and what you need to work on than by watching yourself practicing on camera.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console, and I'll be happy to unmute you so you can speak with Bill. Bill, just since we have come down to a hardcore communication, the most common question is how to get rid of your, the bridging words like, I mean, quick tips. I know you've been giving some good suggestions.
Not to be redundant, but practice helps that. In other words, if you know what you're going to say prior to the encounter, whatever that encounter looks like, again, if it's a meeting or a webinar or a speech or what have you, if you have practiced it beforehand, your fear of the unknown, if you will, is minimized. And you will just naturally, you'll be more relaxed, number one, because you know where you're going, to put it simply, but also because you have verbalized it more than once. So if you know that you're going to say the current population of Pakistan is, X million people, right? If you've done that a few times beforehand, before you do it for real, you go right to it. That's number one. It's there and accessible for you. Number two is to not be afraid of brief pauses. Like that. It feels like an eternity to you. It doesn't really look that way to the audience. We all worry that if we permit ourselves to just let a couple of seconds of silence elapse, we worry that the people in the audience will think that we've lost our place or lost our mind or whatever, lost something. my advice would be to not worry too much about those occasional pauses. And indeed, they can be powerful. If what you've said just prior to the pause was compelling, well, the audience will have the expectation that the next thing you're going to say is going to be fairly interesting also. And so they might be kind of waiting for it. So that takes practice also. But in the final analysis, what I'm suggesting is that if you get to a point and you say to yourself, I can't remember what the current population of Pakistan is, just give yourself a second to think about it, and then if you're lucky, it'll be there.
That's great. That's great advice. Great advice. That pregnant pause sometimes just allows you to get back on track if you have forgotten your place. Yep. Because let's face it, we have sometimes. But it also allows them time to think, because we want people to, fundamentally, we want them to be listening to what's being said, and that's active listening. There's no point in you or I doing a diatribe, stand up in front of 100,000 people, whatever it's going to be, and them just taking lots of notes and giving you a clap at the end and then going away and doing nothing. To me, that was a waste of my trip, frankly. We, as when you're talking to an audience, you want them to act, whether it's your own team, even your family, you want them to go and do something with what you've been saying. Otherwise, pointless opening your mouth in many respects.
Great. Yes, Kamran Bhai, over to you. But after you, I will also try to read some of the questions, comments posted in the chat box. So, Kamran Bhai.
The question, Bob, is that you're making a good eye contact, I observed. Eye contact is a very strange thing on webinars. I'm looking at Neville as he speaks, or Ali, or you, and I'm wondering that if I'm speaking into the camera or the webcam, where do I look? Because I'm drawn towards the images on the screen and the data on the screen. That's the question.
Always try to look directly at the webcam. Once again, I've got an Apple MacBook Air here, and on the top of my screen, there's a little green illuminated dot.
Yes.
So when I'm trying to look at that dot, it looks to you and the other people on the call as though I'm looking at you. It's difficult to maintain this contact with that tiny little pin dot camera, because yes, while you're speaking, I'd rather be looking at you on my screen right now, Kamran, you're in the lower right of my screen. It doesn't make a huge difference. I don't know if you can tell looking at me right now. So right now I'm not looking directly at the camera. I'm looking at an image of you. Can you see the difference between me doing this and now I'm looking into the camera?
Yeah, big difference.
Like you're looking at all three of us.
So to the best of your ability, you want to try to look at the camera. You don't want to be a deer in the headlights, like this. just try to have a relaxed demeanor about yourself and try to maintain contact with the camera.
Just one more very quick question. Speeches, and you were talking about examples from before. Martin Luther King is known to have made this amazing speech, I Have a Dream. And then we have modern day leaders who have this rostrum with a foot pedal and a reflective device where they can read what they're saying left and right. Now, I'm wondering as to whether that takes away from authenticity when we have such technical support or crutches. What do you advise in a situation like this? For example, even in a webinar, one has the privilege of a screen with text. It doesn't show to the audience, but you can be reading as you speak. So is it advisable? What would you suggest on this score?
It's a multi-part answer. In certain situations, using what is called a teleprompter, I think in the UK you call it something different, Neville, but in the States we call it a teleprompter. And so when the President of the United States stands in the well of the the House of Representatives and delivers the State of the Union speech every year. He has two teleprompters. They're pieces of glass on either side that are transparent on one side, and they reflect the words scrolling by so that he can read them. So for certain types of situations, for certain grand speeches like that, teleprompters are appropriate, but probably 95% of the time in business situations, they are not. And there are two reasons for that. Number one is that reading the teleprompter properly is truly a skill which needs to be learned. It's very difficult for most people to read words and not sound as though you are reading words. This is a spoken communication. This is not a written communication. So it should sound as conversational as possible. So with that in mind, I encourage people to liberate themselves from the podium first and foremost, and teleprompters, and to if it's a large group of people, to wear a wireless microphone so you can walk around and get closer to different sides of the audience at different times. In an online presentation like this one, it's the same thing. I think rather than in terms of using a teleprompter or not using a teleprompter, I think rather than simply reading the words on the screen, unless you're really good at it, I think it's better for you to just have notes and to have practiced beforehand so that you can access the information easily. So there won't be a lot of ums and ahs, but so that it also sounds somewhat conversational and not as though you're reading a speech.
Thank you.
Of course.
Just adding to that, before we get into a couple of questions, Ali, I remember, I think it was League 2017 when we were at the Marriott, the electrics went down so many times during my presentation that everyone was pulling their hair out when it went down first time, not knowing how quickly it would come back on again. So I just continued. I had notes, but they were on the screen, so I'd lost my notes. But the thing is, you just continue. And if you know your subject reasonably well enough, I've got quite a booming voice anyway, so a microphone tends to unfortunately make it even louder. So all I did was just walk into the audience. I mean, if you recall, do you recall that, Ali? Yeah,
I know you don't need a mic.
No, thank you. That wasn't the recording bit I was thinking of, but the point is, you just continue. And I think there was a very famous, I can't remember who it was, apologise for this, but there was a very famous person last year where all of the comms went down in a big presentation hall in Silicon Valley. And the presenter, who is a well-known chief exec, just continued. As just as though, what the hell? I mean, comms are down. I'm going to speak from my heart as I would have done anyway. And of course, the more you practice about reading the notes and getting comfortable with the notes and, perhaps dropping a joke in here and there to see if the audience are still awake. Far more preferable than throwing a spear, I always find, because that could hurt somebody. But it does break it up, and it makes it far more entertaining and far more engaging. And you leave the audience laughing at you, which is probably the best thing.
And the last thing I would say about that is that some people feel as though to have notes in one's hand is not desirable because that looks like some kind of a crutch. I disagree with that. I think there's nothing wrong with notes if you want to occasionally refer to them. Here's the next thing that I want to say. The advice I would give about notes, if you're going to have them in your hand, literally, is that you not put your notes on a standard 8.5, 11 inch piece of paper, because paper like that tends to sort of flap in the breeze and make a lot of noise. I would transfer your notes to nice, stiff 5x8 cards. And you can even make it look polished by putting your organization's logo on the side of the card that faces the audience. and then make sure that your handwriting, or ideally you would print your notes on your cards, because occasionally the audience might see your side of the notes, and if you have terrible looking handwriting, it doesn't look very professional. The last thing I would say is number your cards. So if you've got 15 note cards and you drop them, which has been known to happen, you pick them up and you won't have to confuse yourself as to the proper order of the information.
Thank you.
That's a great tip, by the way. For anyone of Cameron and my age group, we remember punch cards.
Yes.
And when you first start to punch in all of your code, the first thing that the lecturer says, remember to order them. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Guilty? I didn't. 15,000 cards later.
All right, gentlemen, I have to read some comments and questions in the chat box if you allow me. But folks, I would appreciate if you could raise your hand. That will be easier. You'll be able to speak directly to Bill or Kamran by Ronel. But let me go. There's a, I believe this is back to the ethics that we were discussing from Mr. Hassan Raza. It's like a comment, but I'll read it over. Big media groups and the government are entwined in a vicious circle of mutual manipulation, myth-taking, and self-interest. Most journalists manipulate news, hide facts, for instance, on COVID-19, which brings depression, anxiety in the society. So it's time to unite people on one platform and focus on truth. Quick comments.
I think, you know, many people have the tendency to look at the news media as this monolithic thing, which I don't agree with. Certainly there are some journalists who have an agenda, and some journalists may be more trustworthy than others, but I may be naive. I like to still believe that most professional journalists are trying to deliver the information the way they see it. I think there's no such thing as a human being who does not have some element of bias, but a professional journalist makes the effort to deliver the information without bias. But to say that all journalists do that, I don't entirely agree with.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. So, may I ask another question, quick?
Very quick, linked to this very question that has been put,
Sure.
Perception and reality. What's your commentary on that?
What's the question exactly? So what's the difference between
perception and reality? Because media is largely sharing information which is being perceived in different ways. So subjectivity and objectivity often get very distorted. I mean, one may be conveying an objective fact, but it may be perceived in different ways. So how much does that distortion have to do with fake news or real news? And that conundrum is a real one. And leadership is about managing perceptions, I've heard. So,
and studies have been done recently that show that conundrum is becoming more prevalent all the time. In other words,
yes.
For example, many people who choose to believe one thing, the more evidence you give to people that indicates that their belief is not necessarily accurate, the more evidence you give tends to make people who think that way dig in even deeper in their beliefs or their opinions. So we're in dangerous territory here when you deliver an objective fact and someone says, well, I choose not to believe that. I choose to believe that the earth is flat. And the more you give me this so-called scientific evidence that the earth is not flat, the more I believe that the earth is flat. So anyway, you've opened up a tremendous can of worms here, Cameron. There's
I didn't. The first question I did.
What it did on the forum. All right, guys, let me move to another one from Ms. Fatima Asad
Thank
Saeed,
you.
hello, Bill. Helpful tips indeed. How do you integrate storytelling or humor effectively and maintain relevance if required?
Well, that's a wonderful question.
And especially if one isn't sure about the online audience profile.
Yeah, well, okay. Two things. First and foremost, try to assess to the best of your ability what the online audience profile is. And you can usually, unless it's going to be by definition an extremely broad audience, you can usually do that fairly well. If you're giving a webinar to the Pakistan Society of Engineers, you know that they'll be interested in a certain subject matter. If you're giving a webinar to the team of Coca-Cola representatives in Pakistan, that's going to be a different audience. But most importantly, I love your question regarding storytelling, because storytelling is something that I rely on all the time. And the reason for that, just very, very simply and somewhat unscientifically, we know that stories resonate. We know that since we all lived in caves together, people have loved hearing stories. And so as you launch into a story, the audience immediately says, ooh, this is going to be good. It's a story. It's not just some sort of dry recitation of facts. And from a scientific point of view, a study was done recently, I think by Yale University, I can't remember which, but basically proving the point that stories make information resonate and stick more effectively than other ways of delivering information. And the experiment they did was they took two control groups, one group of, let's say, 20 people and another separate group of 20 people. They gave group one a list of 10 facts and gave them a minute to look at the list and then afterward asked them how many of those facts they remembered. The second group, they gave the same facts, but woven into a story, woven into a narrative. And the second group's ability to recognize and retain the core information was much more efficient than the first group. So people like hearing stories, and they work in terms of you achieving your goals of getting the audience to remember what you want them to remember. It has to be an appropriate story, obviously. Ideally, it would be germane to the subject matter. My dear Uncle Bill, who passed away a few years ago, was famous for standing up at family gatherings, and he'd start with a story that had nothing to do with everything else. Right? He would tell the story, and it was usually a funny story, and we'd all have a good laugh, and then we'd go talk about something unrelated. So if you do a presentation or if you begin a meeting, try to ensure that there is a point to the story that leads you to the subject matter that you're about to get into. But starting off a meeting or starting off a presentation with a story is just is very effective, because it's often unexpected also, and your audience will appreciate it, and your audience will feel respected by knowing that you have made the effort to make the material interesting to them. In other words, it's not just another Monday morning meeting. Here comes the boss who's going to just start, throwing information at us. She's launched into a story. Where is she going with this? What's the point? I thought this meeting was about our quarterly sales figures, and she's talking about Martin Luther King or whatever it is. As long as it leads directly into the subject at hand, I think storytelling is fantastic. And lastly, humor. If you're good at telling a joke, and if the joke is appropriate, and if the joke is, once again, germane to the subject matter, okay. But be careful with that, because a lot of people don't tell jokes very, very well. And of course, be careful that it won't be controversial.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all told jokes that fell flat. No matter where we've been. Ali, you've locked yourself, man.
Did sorry about that. So anyhow, so let me go to another one from Mr. Fawad Ahmad, who said, what would you suggest how to engage the audience during online training? So before Bill, you answer, or Kamran Bhai Neville, let me just launch this polling. Are you guys seeing something on your screen right now?
Yes.
So here it is. That's another tool you normally get on all those webinar platforms. And this is how we can engage a little bit of audience, you know, to talk, and then you can give them a little time and end the polling. And end the polling, you can share the results as well. Oh, 75% of the crowd has already given the presentation. So Will and Kamran Bhai, Neville, any other quick tips? We have one more question. Caller has raised a hand. In fact, two. So we will try to summarize that because it's already 6:50.
Well, I think if we go down the engage, how do you make it engaging? Storytelling is a classic. You take people on a journey, and the more personal, I've always found that the more personal you make that journey, the more entertaining and engaging it becomes. Because one thing that we're human beings, we've got empathy. If it's a sob story, then I'm not suggesting you tell a sob story. Normally try and tell an upbeat story, but they go with you and they go with the flow. But making it engaging, as Bill said earlier, ask questions. Just make sure that people are still awake, frankly. I mean, even when, we've all spoken in large public audiences, and when you're speaking, you don't look down at your toes and your shoes. You're looking around the audience just to make sure people are awake and they're listening. It's really difficult to do that in the digital arena. Although Ali and I have done some experimenting here by having a camera locally, and we've got an extra Zoom portfolio open, so you can actually see on two screens, you know, looking at people in the audience and see who's yawning, falling asleep, talking to his mates. But equally, as you're talking, and then you start to look around like this, and they're all following you because they think you're actually talking, you know, you're talking to them. So there's lots of tricks you can do, but like anything else, just try it. You know, if it doesn't work for you after a few times, then that's just stop doing it. Try something else, because the likelihood is never going to work for you, you know. And it's as simple as that, really. The more you try and push yourself out of that comfort zone, then you might find the easier it becomes. But don't, you know, just, and the other thing I would say is look at what other people do. I mean, I like watching comedians, not for the fact that they make me laugh, but for how they deliver their subject. What is it in a comedian's rapport where I can be in an audience of 1,000 and I've got my mates around me, and my guy on the right-hand side is laughing away just before me, and I'm not worried at what he's laughing at because the comedian has entertained me. And we may be thinking of exactly the same time that us three mates had done exactly what this comedian had said. And we're all thinking of different locations, different times when that happened. So again, just try it. Go and look at what some of the good people on the digital space do. I find TED Talks really interesting, actually. I mean, most of them are live. But just seeing the different way that people bring their subject to life. I mean, there's thousands of them out there. And, you know, if you want to get good at something, then you need to go and practice. Back to that word practice, I'm afraid.
Yes, Kamran Bhai. Kamran Bhai.
Yeah. Bill, in your journey of becoming a professional in the field that you've chosen, there must have been some highs and lows. So would you care to share an insight, because we learn from mistakes, don't we? Which was an event that you feel was something that you wish didn't happen, but you learned immensely from it? And which has been, let's say, your best moment so far in your professional career? If you could just share those two glimpses with us.
The lowest moment was I was asked to deliver a presentation about the Y2K scare. Everyone remembers that from 20 years ago. We all thought that the clocks were going to stop and all the computer systems in the world were going to stop. And so someone from an organization asked me to come and give a presentation on Y2K. And I said, I think I can do that. I did some research, I gave the presentation, and then some very knowledgeable people in the audience started asking me some questions, which I did not know the answer to. So it was my own hubris that permitted me to do it in the first place. And it took me just so far, but I ended up embarrassing myself because I really wasn't a subject matter. So I would say, challenge yourself with these kinds of encounters, but at the same time, don't try to be something that you're not. In terms of the high points, I feel so incredibly privileged, Kamran. I've worked with so many fascinating and brilliant people all over the world, time in and time out, interesting products, luxury hotels. I think the most satisfying work is when I'm working with really passionate people who are trying to do something to make the world a better place. And forgive me if that sounds a little maudlin, but if I can work with an anti-poverty expert trying to help farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, if I can help that economist tell the story about the need and the solutions, if I can help them to tell that story in a more persuasive way and know that we are really helping people down the line, that's probably the most satisfying thing. But I just generally speaking enjoy helping people find new skills within themselves and to become more self-confident. Let's face it, a lot of people hate public speaking. They're terrified by public speaking. And so if I can get someone to become more self-confident and more proficient, and in so doing help them to become better at their jobs as a result of having become better communicators, that's immensely satisfying.
Thank you, Bill.
Of course, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm also pressed on the time. So I really want to thank Bill for taking the time and appearing on this show. And I hope the audience, whoever is watching it, found it very useful. Once again, I really want to thank you on behalf of YP2G for appearing on this show. And thank you to Neville and Kamran Bhai also for always supporting us. And we've been doing this regularly or every Monday. I know Bill is also working on putting up a complete webinar. Bill, is that true, on the digital space presentation techniques and tips? And I think we will be announcing it pretty much soon in coming days.
That's right. We have a couple of different webinars, the first of which is how to do what we're doing right now more efficiently. Perhaps a 45-minute or a 1-hour webinar on how to set up your environment so that it looks professional and polished, how to create better presentation content for the story that you're telling in the presentation, and then also elements of performance and delivery, body language, eye contact, voice, all of those kinds of things to prepare people for this new reality. I was very encouraged to see that 75% of our audience today said they've already done an online presentation. Fundamentally, it's not that hard to do it well, but there are some specific tips that you can learn so that you can scale it. You can make it easy to do each time.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. I know. I look forward to also attending it. So thank you very much. And I'll just conclude and summarize, if you allow me, Bill and Neville. As you know, this is the month of Ramadan, where mostly in Pakistan and in general, the Muslim world, everybody is fasting. So on the spiritual quotient, as Bill knows that we always have that integral part of our program design in Medina whenever we deliver any leadership programs. It was interesting to see how when you are talking about communication and how to engage, how to remain focused, all those things that we have discussed today. It's interesting that the word that we use in Arabic for praying is called salat. And I've asked even to some of my Arab friends, what does it mean? Most of the time you receive a reply that it means prayer. But it's interesting to know that salat actually means communication. And I learned it when I was in UAE, because the largest telecom company in UAE is called Etisalat. And I used to wonder, what is it? And it means get connected. So God wants us to get connected. God wants us to communicate, and communication is always interactive. It's two-way, it's dialogue, so it can't be just a monologue. So it's very interesting what we have discussed today, and I thought it's relevant in the month of Ramadan. We conclude on a spiritual quotient. So once again, thank you very much. And thank you all of you for attending this webinar and making it an interactive experience for all of us. With that note, I would like to end and conclude. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logged in.
Happy Ramadan to all of our friends.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thanks very much, Bill. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to hand you all will be dismissed out. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.